2. Black helicopters cut through the sky above Ralston General Hospital before anyone on the ground understood what was coming. Inside Trauma Bay 3, a bloodied man in civilian clothes was strapped to a gurney, thrashing against the restraints with the kind of desperate, animal strength that didn't belong in a hospital room. Nurses backed away. Orderlies pressed themselves against the walls. And Dr. Marcus Holt, chief of emergency medicine, was already reaching for the sedative order when one nurse stepped forward instead. She was nobody. That's what they all thought. She leaned close to the man's ear and said 4 words in a voice so quiet nobody else could hear them. He stopped thrashing immediately, and then the doors blew open. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories on this channel don't go where you expect them to go. Drop a like on this video, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't miss what comes next. The morning had started the way most mornings started at Ralston General. Understaffed, overloaded, and held together by people who hadn't slept enough and wouldn't admit it. Mara Voss had been on since 6 a.m. She was 34 years old, medium height, with dark circles she'd stopped bothering to hide, and a ponytail she retied 3 times a shift without thinking about it. She worked the emergency department the way experienced ER nurses work it. Not by running, but by moving with a kind of constant, low-grade urgency that looked like calm from the outside. She knew where everything was. She knew which attending was going to order what before they ordered it. She knew which patients were going to turn and which ones were just scared. She was good at her job. She knew that. The problem was that almost nobody else at Ralston General agreed. Dr. Marcus Holt made that very clear on a daily basis. He was the kind of physician who had decided early in his career that the hierarchy of a hospital was a moral fact rather than an administrative convenience, and he enforced it accordingly. When Mara offered a clinical observation that turned out to be correct, he acknowledged the outcome without acknowledging her contribution. When she pushed back on an order she thought was wrong, he smiled the way people smile at something slightly irritating and then proceeded exactly as he'd planned. She had worked under him for 2 years. In that time he had learned her name, but not her face. That Tuesday started quiet enough that she let herself think it might stay that way. It didn't. The call came in at 9:47. Incoming trauma, male, mid-40s, found unresponsive on the shoulder of Route 9 outside Delmore, with no ID, no phone, no wallet. The paramedics were cautious in the way they described him, which meant something about him had already made them nervous. By the time the gurney came through the bay doors, Mara understood why. He was large, over 6 feet, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of physical conditioning that didn't come from a gym membership. His clothes were civilian, dark jeans, a gray long-sleeve shirt, but they were worn in a specific way, fitted for movement rather than appearance. There were abrasions on his hands consistent with falls on hard ground, and a deep laceration above his left eyebrow that had been bleeding long enough to dry on the side of his face. The paramedics had him strapped to the gurney in 4-point restraints, and he was using every one of them. "Found him about a mile east of the overpass," the paramedic said, handing off the chart. "Appeared disoriented, combative, no response to verbal commands, no substances in the tox screen we ran on scene. Vitals are elevated but stable." Mara looked at the man. He was fighting the restraints with a rhythm to it. Not the random thrashing of someone panicking, but something systematic. His eyes were open and focused, scanning the room in short, deliberate passes. Not confused, threat assessing. She stepped toward the gurney and he snapped toward her immediately, which made the 2 orderlies behind her take a step back. "Incoming trauma," called a nurse near the door. "Holt's been paged." Mara kept her eyes on the patient. "What's your name?" she said, keeping her voice level. He didn't answer. His eyes moved past her to the ceiling, to the door, back to her. "Nobody's going to hurt you," she said. "You're in a hospital." Something in his jaw tightened. His breathing was controlled in a way that meant he was working to control it. Dr. Marcus Holt came through the bay doors 30 seconds later with his coat half-buttoned and an expression that communicated he'd been interrupted from something more important. He scanned the chart the paramedic was still holding, glanced at the patient once, and made his decision. Start a sedation protocol. 5 milligrams midazolam, IV push. Hold on, Mara said. Holt looked at her the way he always looked at her when she said something he hadn't asked for. Nurse Voss. He's not in psychotic break, she said. Look at his eyes. He's tracking. He's oriented to location. He's been scanning the room systematically since he came in. That's not a dissociated state. He's combative and unresponsive to commands. He's hypervigilant. There's a difference. The difference, Holt said, pulling on a glove, is that I've been doing this for 23 years and you have not. Prepare the midazolam. The second nurse in the bay moved toward the medication cart. Mara stepped in front of her. Not aggressively, just enough to pause the motion. Dr. Holt, she said, if we sedate him without knowing why he's presenting like this, we could mask something serious. A head injury. A metabolic crisis. Something neurological we haven't ruled out yet. Holt's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room did. Step aside. I'm not trying to undermine you. I'm telling you that sedating this patient right now is a mistake. Step aside, or I will have you removed from this bay. She stepped aside. The nurse administered the midazolam. Holt moved toward the gurney with his penlight, and the patient, who had been straining against his restraints with that steady, focused effort, went completely still. Not from the medication. The midazolam wasn't fast enough for that. He went still because he was looking at Mara. He had locked onto her face with an expression she couldn't immediately name, and then, in a voice wrecked from whatever he'd been through, he said something. It was 7 syllables. A phrase. Not English. Mara's breath caught. She knew what it was. She knew exactly what it was, and the knowing of it hit her somewhere so deep and so old that for a moment the hospital room stopped existing, and she was somewhere else entirely. Cold air, dark ground. The particular kind of quiet that exists in places where something terrible has happened, and everyone is still waiting to find out how bad. She pulled herself back. The patient was still looking at her. His eyes were clearer now, more focused, like something in him had shifted. What did he say? Holt asked, not because he cared what the answer was, but because he'd noticed her reaction. I'm not sure, Mara said. It was the first time she had lied to a physician in 2 years at Ralston General. She moved to the other side of the gurney, slowly, hands visible, no sudden motions, and leaned down close to the patient's level. She could feel Holt watching her. She didn't look back at him. I heard you, she said quietly. Can you hear me? His breathing changed. You're clear, she said. This is a medical facility. You're not in the field. His eyes closed for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened them, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. How do you know that sequence? Because I was trained on it, she said, a long time ago. That's classified. I know. He stared at her. Who are you? Right now I'm your nurse, she said, and I need you to work with me. Can you do that? Something shifted in his face. The threat assessing stopped. His shoulders came down a fraction of an inch. Holt grabbed her arm. Not hard, but with enough authority to make the intention clear. What was that? He said. And why are you communicating privately with my patient? I was getting him calm. Using what? What did you say to him? I explained where he was. In what language? His, she said. Holt's grip tightened slightly, then released. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that had moved past professional irritation into something more considered. Step out, he said. Dr. Holt, I'm not asking. He turned to the orderly near the door. Please escort Nurse Voss to the corridor and make sure she stays there. The orderly, a young man named Derek who had never once made eye contact with Mara during an argument, approached with an apologetic expression and a body positioned like a door he needed her to walk through. She went. She stood in the corridor outside Trauma Bay 3 with her hands at her sides and her heart working slightly harder than usual, and she thought about the phrase the patient had used. She thought about the last time she'd heard it and the context in which she'd learned it, and the years she had spent building a very deliberate distance between herself and that context. She thought about the way the patient had looked at her when she said she'd been trained on it, like she was the first real thing he'd seen in a long time. Through the narrow window in the bay door, she could see Holt proceeding with the sedation. She could see the patient's eyes closing, finally, from the medication, and she watched the specific way his body registered unconsciousness, which was not the way a civilian body registered it. She pulled her phone out and looked at it for a long moment, not at anything on the screen, just at the dark glass of it, thinking about a number she hadn't dialed in years. Then she put it back in her pocket. It took 11 minutes. That was how long it took from the moment Mara was removed from Trauma Bay 3 to the moment two men in civilian clothes, dark pants, dark jackets, the kind of deliberately average appearance that people trained to be invisible wear in public spaces, walked through the main ER entrance and spoke to the charge nurse at the desk. She didn't hear what they said. She watched the charge nurse's face change, and that told her enough. Then came the sound. It was distant at first, a low rhythmic percussion that the building's HVAC system initially swallowed and then didn't. The people in the waiting room started looking at the ceiling. A child asked her mother what the noise was. The mother said she didn't know, which was unusual because the noise was very recognizable once it was close enough. Rotor wash. 2 helicopters flying low. Mara walked to the window at the end of the corridor and watched them descend toward the hospital's rooftop pad. Matte gray, no visible markings, the kind of aircraft that didn't file standard flight plans. They landed in formation with the kind of practice coordination that spoke to repetition. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered it. Mara Voss, Voss, said a male voice she didn't recognize. Don't go anywhere. The call ended. She was still looking at the phone when the stairwell door at the end of the corridor opened and 4 people came through it. 2 in tactical gear, weapons holstered but hands positioned, and 2 in the same deliberately average civilian clothes as the men she'd seen at the front desk. Behind them was a woman in her 50s, silver-haired, in a dark blazer with a government-issue badge clipped to her lapel. They moved through the corridor with a directness that parted people like water around a bow, and they stopped in front of Mara. Mara Voss? The woman said. Yes. I'm Deputy Director Sandra Keel, Defense Intelligence. The man in Trauma Bay 3 is a protected federal witness under active threat assessment. We've been tracking his location for 11 hours. She paused. We were told you communicated with him using a restricted protocol sequence. By who? The attending physician filed an incident report approximately 8 minutes ago. Mara processed that. 8 minutes. Holt had been annoyed enough to file a report on her in the middle of treating an incoming trauma patient. What he said to me, she began. We're aware of what he said, Keel said. The sequence he used is from a classified Special Operations communication protocol that was operational between 2009 and 2014. It was never published. It was never leaked. There are fewer than 40 people still alive who were trained on it. She looked at Mara steadily. You, apparently, are one of them. The corridor had gone quiet around them in the way that hospital corridors go quiet when something happens that isn't medical. I was an Army combat medic, Mara said. 7th Special Forces Group. I was embedded with a forward surgical team in Kandahar for 2 rotations, and then I was temporarily attached to a special operations element in 2012 for a mission I can't name in a hallway. I was trained on that protocol as part of that attachment. She kept her voice flat. I left the service in 2014. I've been a civilian since then. Keel looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. You were attached to Task Force Meridian. It wasn't a question. Mara didn't answer it. The man in that bay, Keel said, is the last surviving member of that task force. The fluorescent lights above them hummed. Someone's monitor beeped down the hall. A cartwheel squeaked on linoleum somewhere around the corner. Mara thought about the way he'd said, "How do you know that sequence?" Not suspicious, exactly, but careful. The way a person is careful when the answer to a question matters more than usual. What's his condition? She asked. That's what we need you to tell us, Keel said, because right now the physician in that room has him sedated, and we need him conscious, and we need someone he'll actually talk to. She paused. He was saying your name when the paramedics found him. We didn't know who you were until we ran the protocol sequence. Mara looked back at the door of Trauma Bay 3. Through the narrow window, she could see Holt writing on a chart. The patient was still. He's been poisoned, Mara said. Keel's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. What? When I was in the bay, before Holt had me removed. She had been moving toward the door before she'd consciously decided to. I saw the IV line. The fluid in the secondary bag had a color differential. It's subtle. Most people wouldn't catch it. But the tinting was wrong for standard saline. Someone already got to your supply chain. She pushed the door open. Holt turned from the chart, and whatever he was about to say died when he saw the woman with the federal badge come through behind Mara. "Step back from the patient," Keel said. "Excuse me. Federal protective order. Step back." Holt looked from Keel to Mara with an expression that had never occurred on his face before, genuine uncertainty. He stepped back. Mara went straight to the IV line. She traced it back from the catheter to the secondary bag. And she was right. The tint was wrong, barely perceptible under the fluorescent lights. But there if you knew what normal looked like, which she did, because she'd spent 2 years in an ER, and 2 years before that in conditions where wrong fluid in a line meant someone died. "Cut this," she said to the nearest agent. "Now, don't let it drip further." The agent moved. "What is she doing?" Holt said. Someone tell me what's happening in my emergency department." "Someone poisoned your IV supply," Mara said. "At least this bag." She was already checking the other lines, the monitoring leads, the medication port. "If they got to this one, we need to check everything in this bay." "That's not possible," Holt said. "Our supply chain is wrong," said Mara, "about a lot of things." She didn't look at him when she said it. The patient was still under from the midazolam, his chest rising and falling with the even rhythm of chemically assisted sleep, and Mara worked around him with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this in worse conditions than a well-lit trauma bay. She checked vitals. She checked access points. She evaluated the laceration above his eye, deeper than she'd initially assessed, possibly involving the periosteum, would need imaging, and she cataloged what she knew and what she didn't, building the clinical picture the way she always built it, from the ground up, with what was actually in front of her. Keel was on a phone call in the corner. The 2 agents in tactical gear had positioned themselves at the door in a way that made it functionally impassable. Holt was standing against the far wall with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had arrived at a situation without any of the context necessary to navigate it. "The bag," Mara said to Keel. "I need to know what's in it." "We'll have it analyzed." "I need to know in the next 20 minutes, before the midazolam clears and he starts coming around. Because if anything from that bag already entered his system, I need to know what I'm managing." Keel said something into the phone and then looked up. 20 minutes. 15 would be better. The woman almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that suggested she was used to people telling her what would be better in an informational tone that meant do it. Mara checked the patient's pupils. Equal and reactive, which was something. His blood pressure was lower than it had been on intake, the sedation, or the beginning of something else. She increased the monitoring frequency and updated the chart and tried not to think about the last time she'd worked this close to someone from that particular part of her life. She had spent 10 years making sure there was no overlap between what she used to be and what she was now. The patient had apparently not agreed to those terms. She was writing the updated vitals when his hand closed around her wrist, not roughly, with that same controlled, deliberate pressure that everything he did seemed to carry. His eyes were open, barely, fighting the midazolam like a man who had survived things that made chemical sedation feel like an inconvenience. "Mara," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. "I'm here," she said. "They know where I am." "I know." "The files?" He stopped. Something moved across his face, pain, or the effort of keeping something back. "The files have to get out. If I don't make it, you're going to make it." "If I don't," he said, and his grip tightened slightly, and his eyes found hers with a directness that cut through the sedation and the clinical distance and every layer she'd built in 10 years. "The drive is in the lining of my left boot. It doesn't leave this room without a federal chain of custody. You understand? Nobody touches it. Not the doctors. Not the agents out there, unless Keel personally vouches for them. Nobody." "I understand," she said. "You know what's on it?" She didn't answer immediately. "Mara." His voice was quieter now, the sedation pulling him back down. "Do you know?" I think, she said carefully, that I know enough. His hand loosened, his eyes closed. In the corner, Keel had ended her call and was watching. Outside, through the narrow window in the bay door, Mara could see the corridor where she'd been standing 11 minutes ago when this started, and she could see two men who hadn't been there before, standing near the nurse's station with lanyards that didn't match the hospital's current badge format, and the kind of studied casualness that meant they were working very hard at not looking like what they were. She looked at the man on the gurney. She looked at the IV bag on the floor where the agent had cut the line. She looked at the two men in the corridor whose badges were wrong, and she thought, this is not over. This is not even close to over. The doors to the ER burst open at the far end of the building. She heard it before she felt it, a percussive bang that shook the frame, and then the lights went out. The emergency lights kicked on 3 seconds after the main power died, red-tinted, low, the kind of illumination that made everything look like it was already on fire. Mara didn't wait for someone to tell her what to do. She grabbed the gurney rail with both hands and looked at the two agents at the door. We need to move him, now. The taller agent, the one who hadn't spoken yet, was already on a radio, his voice low and clipped. Keel crossed the bay in 4 strides and came to the opposite side of the gurney, and for a woman in a blazer who worked behind a desk, she moved with a decisiveness that Mara noted and filed away. Where? Keel said. There's a secondary trauma suite at the end of the east corridor, no public access, connects to the hospital's service level through a supply corridor that most of the staff don't use. Mara was already unlocking the gurney wheels. If those men at the nurse's station are here for him, they came through the main entrance. The service corridor goes a different direction. How do you know the layout that well? I've worked here 2 years. I eat lunch in different places. It wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that Mara had memorized the floor plan of Ralston General on her 3rd week of employment, the way she had memorized the floor plan of every building she'd worked in since she left the service, because 10 years of civilian life hadn't fully convinced her that knowing your exits was a habit she could afford to drop. But that was more than Keel needed right now. Holt stepped forward. You are not moving that patient without my authorization. He is hemodynamically compromised, Mara said. Yes. Which is why we're not having this conversation. She looked at the agent with the radio. Can you take the IV pole? He took the IV pole. They went through the back of the bay. The east corridor was empty, which either meant they'd gotten ahead of whatever was happening at the main entrance, or it meant something worse that Mara didn't want to think about yet. The emergency lighting turned the hallway into a red tunnel, and the gurney's wheels were loud on the linoleum in a way they never were when the building's normal ambient noise was running. Somewhere behind them, she heard shouting. Not panicked, directed, the kind of shouting that meant someone was issuing orders to people who were listening. How many? She said to the agent with the radio. Unknown. We have 2 confirmed at the main entrance and at least 1 more near radiology. Possibly more. Possibly, she said. We're working on it. The patient's eyes were half open. The midazolam was fighting a losing battle against whatever his nervous system had decided it needed to do. His vitals on the portable monitor were holding, blood pressure lower than she wanted, heart rate elevated, but nothing that screamed immediate crisis if she could get him somewhere with proper equipment and no one trying to kill him. Stay with me, she said, not loudly, just enough. His head turned toward her voice. I know, he said, which wasn't an answer to anything she'd said, but was also, somehow, exactly right. The secondary suite was where she'd said it was, a room that had been used for overflow during the hospital's last census crisis and hadn't been fully restocked since, which meant it was functional but sparse. 2 of the wall-mounted monitors were still working off the hospital's backup power. Mara got the patient transferred, got the lines reconnected, got the monitor leads placed with the focused, slightly aggressive efficiency of someone who had done emergency setup in worse conditions than this, and was drawing on that muscle memory now without fully deciding to. Keel stood near the door with one of the agents and spoke in low, rapid bursts into her phone. The other agent had positioned himself in the corridor outside. Holt had followed them. She hadn't asked him to. She hadn't told him not to either, because there was a part of her that understood, whatever his failings, and they were considerable, He was the attending physician, and this was still his hospital. And somewhere underneath the hierarchy and the ego, there was probably a doctor who didn't want a patient to die on his watch. "What's in that secondary bag?" he said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was him catching up. "That's what we're waiting to find out," Mara said. "You pulled his IV." "I pulled a compromised line." You don't have the authority to—" "Someone put something in your hospital's IV supply," she said. And she said it quietly because she didn't need the whole room to hear it, just him. This patient was specifically targeted, which means someone either accessed your supply chain before he arrived, which required knowing he was coming here, or someone accessed it after he arrived, which required someone already inside this building. She let that land. So when you want to talk about authority, I'd suggest we start with how that happened on your watch. Holt's mouth opened and then closed. It was the first time she'd seen him without a ready response, and it didn't feel like a victory. It just felt like a fact that needed to exist between them so they could move forward. "Help me or don't," she said, "but decide fast." He stayed. The analysis on the IV bag came back in 19 minutes, not 20, which meant someone on Keel's team was working quickly. Keel read the result off her phone and looked up at Mara with an expression that had shifted into something more careful. "Succinylcholine derivative," she said. "Modified. Slower onset, designed to look like cardiac arrest from natural causes." Mara processed that. "How much did he receive before we cut the line?" "They're estimating based on bag volume. Possibly a small amount, possibly none. The flow rate was low. I need to monitor his cardiac rhythm for the next 2 hours minimum, and I need a second IV established with verified supply." She looked at Holt. "Can you verify your supply in this wing?" "I can pull from sealed stock in the locked pharmacy," he said, and there was something different in his voice now. Not humble exactly, but focused in a way that suggested the doctor underneath the physician was paying attention. "It hasn't been accessed since this morning's distribution." "Do that." He left. Mara sat on the edge of the equipment cart near the patient's bed and let herself have exactly 15 seconds of not moving, which was all she was going to take. The patient's chest rose and fell. The monitor beeped with the faintly annoying regularity that she'd spent 2 years tuning out and was now finding deeply reassuring. His color was better than it had been in the bay. "His name," she said to Keel. "What do I call him?" Keel considered that for a moment. Rhett Calloway, that's his actual name. Captain, Army Special Forces, retired on paper about 4 years ago." "On paper?" "He was running an independent operation collecting documentation on a military incident that was classified and subsequently suppressed. He came to us 8 weeks ago with partial evidence. We've been trying to get him to a secure location ever since." Keel's voice stayed even, but Mara noticed the tension in it. The specific tension of someone who knew that 8 weeks and trying in the same sentence meant something had gone wrong repeatedly. "He wouldn't go. He said he needed to finish what he was collecting." "What was he collecting?" Keel looked at her steadily. "That's above your clearance level." "My clearance level," Mara said, "lapsed 10 years ago." "Yes." "And yet you're here because he said my name." "Yes." "So either you bring me current or you're working with less than you have," Mara said. "I'm not going to push, but if he wakes up and there's something I need to understand to keep him alive, medically or otherwise, not knowing it is a liability." Keel was quiet for a moment. Outside the door, somewhere down the corridor, there was a sound that could have been a door or could have been something else, and both of them registered it without commenting on it. "There was a military strike," Keel said finally. 2013, Eastern Afghanistan, a region called the Surkai Valley. The official record says a confirmed insurgent compound. The actual record—" She stopped. 31 civilians, mostly women, several children. The strike was ordered by a senior officer who had received intelligence he knew to be false, and the record was subsequently altered, and the witnesses were systematically removed. The monitor beeped. Mara kept her face level. "Removed," she said. 11 members of Task Force Meridian were present in the region during the window of the strike. Over the last 4 years, 8 of them have died. 2 accidents, 1 suicide officially, 1 training incident, 4 others. Keel's voice didn't waver, but her jaw was tight. Rhett Calloway is the last one. Mara looked at the man on the bed. 2013. Surkhai Valley. She had been in Kandahar in 2013, attached to a forward surgical element that had processed casualties from a dozen different operations she'd never been given the full context of. She thought about the ones that hadn't added up, the ones where the numbers were off, where the after-action report she'd glimpsed over someone's shoulder in a command tent hadn't matched what had actually come through her surgical bay. She had told herself she didn't know enough to be certain. She had been very careful to keep telling herself that. "The drive in his boot," she said. "If it contains what we think it contains," Keel said, "it's enough to prosecute." Then why is he still alive? Because whoever ordered this operation has resources inside federal infrastructure. We've had 2 attempts to move Calloway to protective custody that were compromised before they started. Keel looked at her directly. "We don't know the full scope of the breach, which means the only people I currently trust in this building are the 4 agents I brought with me personally." Mara absorbed that. "And me?" she said. "He said your name," Keel said. "For now, that's enough." It wasn't a ringing endorsement. Mara appreciated the honesty. She stood up and went back to the patient, to Rhett, and checked his lines, checked the monitor, ran her hands over the sequence of assessment points with the practiced automaticity of someone who didn't need to think about the order anymore. His skin was warmer. His pressure was edging back up. She was rechecking the ECG lead placement when she found it. It was small. A device, roughly the size of a matchbook, adhered to the underside of the monitoring lead near his left shoulder. Not a hospital device. The adhesive was different, slightly darker, and it had been placed with precision that suggested whoever had done it knew exactly where a routine assessment would start and where it might not look. She didn't move for a second. Then she pulled it free in one clean motion, held it between her fingers, and turned to show Keel. Keel crossed the room in 3 steps, took it from her without touching the adhesive surface, and her expression said everything without saying anything. "Tracking?" Mara asked. "Or transmission," Keel said. "Either way." She looked at her agent. "We need to move. Again." "There's nowhere left to move him in this building," the agent said. "Then we don't stay in the building," Mara said. Both of them looked at her. "The service corridor I mentioned connects to the hospital's basement maintenance level. From there, there's a loading dock that the medical supply trucks use. It's on the south side of the building, different access road than the main entrance, not visible from the front. If your transport is, our primary transport is on the roof," the agent said. "Can you get a secondary?" He looked at Keel. "Make the call," Keel said. While he made the call, Mara went back to Rhett's chart and did something she'd never done before in 2 years at Ralston General. She falsified a record. Not the clinical data, which she kept accurate, but the location. She entered a transfer notation that placed him in Imaging Suite C, which was on the opposite end of the building from where they were, and she routed it through the system with a physician authorization code that Holt had left logged in on the room's terminal. She stared at what she'd done for a moment, then she closed the terminal. "You didn't see that," she said to the room. "See what?" said Keel, which was the closest thing to approval Mara was going to get. Rhett was conscious enough to register the movement when they started transferring him to the portable gurney. His eyes tracked the room, found Mara, and something in him settled in the way it had in the trauma bay. Not relaxed, but recalibrated, like a compass that had been spinning and found north. "Where are we going?" he said. "Out," she said. "The files. I know where they are. They're not going anywhere without you." He nodded, which was harder than it looked. She could see the effort in it. The service corridor was narrower than a standard hospital hallway, lined with conduit and pipe runs and the kind of functional ugliness that hospitals keep behind their public faces. The lighting down here was standard fluorescent, which meant the power outage hadn't reached the backup circuits on this level. The wheels of the gurney were quieter on the concrete floor. They moved quickly. Mara was at the head of the gurney, the agent with the radio behind her, Keel behind him. The second agent had stayed in the secondary suite with orders to maintain the appearance that the room was occupied, buying time on the tracking device's last known location. Halfway down the corridor, Rhett's hand came up and touched her wrist. She slowed. "There's someone ahead," he said. His voice was low, and she wouldn't have taken it seriously from almost anyone else, but she had worked with people who had learned to register threat at a biological level, and she recognized what that sounded like. She held up a fist. They stopped. The corridor ahead bent left. The sound she'd been processing as HVAC was, on second listen, not quite right. It had a rhythm to it that ventilation systems didn't have. "How far to the loading dock?" the agent murmured. "About 60 meters past that bend," Mara said, equally quiet. "Alternate route?" She thought. "There's a parallel utility corridor that branches off 20 meters back. It's longer, takes us around the mechanical room, adds maybe 4 minutes. The agent looked at Keel. "Go back," Keel said. They reversed course, quiet and deliberate, and found the branch corridor, which was darker than the main service tunnel and smelled of old machinery and standing water from a slow drain somewhere. The gurney's larger wheels didn't love the surface, and Mara found herself compensating for the slight pull to the left with a grip and a body weight adjustment she'd learned in a different context entirely. Field transport, rough ground, move the patient without moving them more than you have to. They came around the back of the mechanical room and into a wider space that opened onto the loading dock's interior approach. A truck was backed against the dock. Standard medical supply, white, anonymous. Mara didn't know if that was Keel's secondary transport or something that had been there already, and she didn't have time to work it out because two things happened at almost the same moment. The agent's radio crackled with a voice that said 3 hostiles, east entrance, heading towards service level. And the door at the far end of the loading dock opened, and a man came through it who was not a medical supply driver. The agent moved before Mara had fully processed it, putting himself between the door and the gurney with a speed and economy of motion that she recognized from a different life. There was a brief, brutal moment of controlled violence that she kept her attention away from because her job was the patient. Rhett was trying to sit up. "Don't," she said. "I can—" "You have an active IV and your blood pressure is still low. You can't do anything useful right now. Let them work." He looked at her with an expression that was partly frustration and partly something that might have been, under different circumstances, amusement. "You always this direct?" "Only when someone's about to pull their own IV." He lay back. Not defeated. Strategic. The difference was in the jaw. The agent had the situation at the door managed. Keel was on the phone again, coordinating something Mara could hear but not fully parse. The truck backed against the dock turned out to be Keel's secondary transport. The driver was one of hers, had been holding position for 11 minutes. They loaded Rhett with the careful, slightly improvised efficiency of people doing something correctly without having planned exactly this version of it. The portable monitor came with him. Mara climbed in after because nobody told her not to, and because the alternative was standing on a loading dock in a hospital that had just been infiltrated by people trying to kill her patient. Keel got in last and pulled the door. The truck moved. For a few minutes, nobody spoke. Mara monitored vitals, adjusted a line that had shifted during the transfer, and tried to do the arithmetic of the last 90 minutes in a way that produced a coherent picture. She wasn't sure it did. There were too many moving parts she didn't have positions for. "The device they put on him," she said to Keel. "If it was transmitting, they know he's been moved." "Yes." "So they'll be looking for the truck." "Yes." "Where are we going?" "A secure DIA facility 40 minutes from here. It's off the grid records, not listed in any federal property database that's been accessible to the breach." "You're confident about that?" Keel looked at her steadily. "I'm not confident about anything tonight. I'm working with the best information I have." That was honest, at least. Rhett's eyes were open, fixed on the metal roof of the truck's cargo space, and Mara could see him working through something. The particular internal processing of a person with a tactical mind running options and variables. "Keel," he said. "Calloway." "The second witness." He turned his head to look at her. "I told you about a second witness. In the preliminary briefing, someone else from the valley who survived and has been in hiding." Keel's expression shifted fractionally. "We haven't been able to locate—" "I have her location," Rhett said. "I've had it for 3 weeks. I didn't give it to you because I didn't know the size of the breach." He paused, and the effort of extended speech in his current condition was visible in the slight tension around his eyes. "I still don't know the full size of it." Mara watched Keel absorb this. If there's a second witness, Keel said carefully, with corroborating documentation, it ends the case, Rhett said. Completely. No gaps. No alternate interpretations. Everything I have on that drive plus what she has, there's no way out for anyone involved. Keel was quiet. The problem, Rhett said, is that I'm the only one who knows where she is, and right now, I'm not exactly mobile. The truck hit a bump. Mara's hand went to the IV line automatically. The monitor beeped steadily, indifferently. She thought about the phrase not exactly mobile in the voice of a man who had spent 4 years running a solo operation to document a military atrocity, surviving the systematic elimination of everyone who had been there with him, arriving at a hospital with no identification and a body that had clearly taken considerable damage, and was still, in a truck, on a gurney, with a compromised IV, trying to finish what he'd started. Not exactly mobile. She almost laughed, which was not something she had expected to do today. I can access a secure terminal at the facility, Keel said. If you give me the location, I can have a protective team en route within the hour. It's not that simple, Rhett said. She won't respond to a team she doesn't know. She's been in hiding for 2 years. She'll run. Then what do you suggest? He turned his head and looked at Mara. She met his eyes. No, she said. You know how to approach someone who doesn't trust federal infrastructure, he said. You've done it before. That was a long time ago. The skill doesn't expire. Rhett. Her name is Deanna Marsh, he said. She's a former Army intelligence analyst. She was in the valley doing field assessment work when the strike happened. She survived because she was on the perimeter. His voice was quieter now, the midazolam and blood loss and plain exhaustion pulling at it. She's been alone for 2 years with documentation that could end this. She deserves to not be alone anymore. Mara looked at Keel. Keel looked back at her with an expression that said, I cannot order you to do anything. I cannot even ask. But I'm telling you the situation. The truck moved through the dark, 40 minutes to a secure facility. A second witness hiding somewhere with 2 years of isolation and documentation that could close a case around a mass atrocity and the people who'd buried it. Mara thought about the way she'd stood in that corridor 90 minutes ago with her phone in her hand, looking at a number she hadn't called in a decade. She thought about the fact that she'd put the phone back in her pocket. Then she thought about the 16-year-old girl she'd never stopped thinking about, a photograph and an after-action report she'd seen over someone's shoulder in a command tent in 2013 in a file she hadn't been cleared to read that had haunted her with the specific persistence of something you saw and couldn't unsee. Outside the truck, headlights appeared in the rear window, coming from behind, matching their speed, and there were 2 of them, which was one more than there should have been on a road this empty at this time of night. Keel saw the headlights at the same moment Mara did. She didn't say anything. She just leaned forward and tapped twice on the partition separating the cargo space from the cab, and the truck accelerated in the careful, deliberate way of a driver who had been briefed on exactly this possibility. How far out are we? Mara said. 22 minutes, Keel said. Can we make it? That depends on how many there are and whether they have anything heavier than small arms. Keel was already on the radio, her voice clipped and specific, calling in the tail and requesting intercept from whatever assets she had positioned ahead. Mara caught fragments, grid coordinates, vehicle description, the word expedite twice. Rhett's hand found the gurney rail. Don't worry, Mara said, because he was clearly calculating whether he could be useful, and the answer was that he absolutely could not. There's a sidearm in Keel's left jacket pocket, he said. I'm aware. You know how to use one. I'm a nurse. You're also... Right now I am a nurse, she said, and my job is making sure you arrive at wherever we're going with your heart still beating. So unless you want to explain to me why your pressure just dropped 4 points in the last 3 minutes, save it. He saved it. The pressure drop was real, and it concerned her more than the headlights. The succinylcholine derivative, even a small dose, could cause secondary cardiac effects that didn't present immediately, and she was working with a portable monitor, a limited kit, and a moving vehicle on a road that was getting less smooth as they turned off the main route onto something that felt like a county road. She increased the monitoring interval and checked his capillary refill and thought, not for the first time in her career, that the gap between what she could assess and what she could actually do about it was one of the more honest cruelties of emergency medicine. The truck swerved, not violently, but enough. A controlled evasive that told her the driver had seen something ahead that he didn't like. The headlights behind them were still there, closer now, and she could see through the rear window's small grille that there were actually 3 sets of lights, not 2, which meant something had joined them in the last 60 seconds. "Keel," she said. "I see them. We're not going to make it to your facility." Keel didn't answer, which was its own answer. The radio crackled. A different voice this time, coming from ahead rather than behind, and it said something that made Keel's expression do something complicated and then resolve into a decision. "There's a secondary option," Keel said. 12 minutes. Former agricultural facility the DIA acquired 2 years ago. It's not equipped for what Callaway needs medically, but it's defensible. Define not equipped. Basic trauma supplies, no imaging, no surgical capability. Mara looked at Rhett's monitor. His pressure had stabilized slightly, which she chose to take as provisional good news. The laceration above his eye needed proper irrigation and closure that hadn't happened yet. She didn't know the full extent of what else he'd sustained before the paramedics found him, and the compromised IV bag meant she was working without a complete picture of his current chemical status. "Is there a physician at this secondary location?" "No." "Then I'm what you've got," Mara said. "Go." Keel told the driver. The truck turned hard enough that the gurney shifted and Mara caught it with both hands and her hip against the side wall, maintaining the line's position through pure stubbornness. Rhett grabbed the rail again, and this time she didn't tell him to let go because the grip was stabilizing rather than preparatory, just a man holding on to something solid while the world moved. The pursuing vehicles fell back slightly on the turn. Not lost, but buying them something, maybe 2 minutes. "The drive," Rhett said, "still in your boot. If something happens to me, nothing's happening to you." "Mara." His voice was quiet and exact. "If something happens to me, the drive goes to Keel personally, not to any agent she hasn't vouched for individually. The file structure has a password. It's the date of the Surkai Valley strike followed by the last 4 digits of the primary field commander's service number. You don't need to know those numbers now. I'll give them to you when we stop. But you need to know that the structure exists and the password is necessary. Without it, the files look corrupted." She looked at him. "You're not going to need me to remember that." "Probably not," he said, "but probably isn't the same as definitely, and I've learned not to confuse them." She committed it to memory anyway. The agricultural facility turned out to be a long, low building set back from the road behind a perimeter of mature trees that had been there long before whatever the DIA used it for. The truck pulled around the back and into a structure that had been a barn and was now something else. Reinforced doors, motion-activated lighting that came on in sections rather than all at once, and the specific quiet of a space that had been systematically insulated from outside noise. Keel was out before the vehicle fully stopped. 2 agents Mara hadn't seen before came from inside the building. She clocked them as Keel's people from the way Keel interacted with them, the shorthand of an established team. They moved Rhett inside. The supplies were where Keel had said they'd be. A trauma kit, supplemental oxygen, IV materials still sealed in pharmaceutical packaging that had a proper lot number and clear saline, which Mara checked twice before establishing a new line. She found a suture kit and a light source and did the work on the laceration that should have been done 2 hours ago, which Rhett sat through without complaint and with only a single sharp exhale at the deepest part of the irrigation, which she counted as reasonable given that she was working without proper anesthetic. "This is going to scar," she said. "Adds character," he said. "It adds nothing. It's a scar." "You're very literal. You're very relaxed for someone with a head wound. I've had worse." She finished the closure and dressed it, and sat back and let herself look at the overall picture. A man who was in significantly better shape than he'd been in Trauma Bay 3, which was either a testament to her work or to how resilient he was, or most likely both. His color was better. His pressure had come back to something she was willing to call acceptable given the circumstances. The ECG was showing a normal sinus rhythm with some elevation she was watching, but not ready to call alarming. He was going to make it through the night. She let that fact sit for exactly as long as it took to feel real, and then she moved on. Keel came in from the main space with the expression of someone who had been making decisions and wasn't finished yet. The pursuing vehicles pulled off approximately 4 kilometers back. We don't know if they missed the turnoff or if they're repositioning. Repositioning, Rhett said. That's my assessment too, Keel said. Which gives us a limited window. She looked at Mara. Deanna Marsh. Callaway gave me a location. It's a mountain property in the Delmore Range, about 63 kilometers from here. We have a team that can be there in 90 minutes. She'll run, Rhett said. I know. Which is why I'm looking at Nurse Voss. Mara had known this was coming since the truck. She'd had the whole drive to think about whether she was going to agree to it, and the answer she'd arrived at was complicated and probably said more about her than she wanted it to. Walk me through the location, she said. The property was a former ranger station that had been sold into private ownership in 2019. Small, isolated, accessible by one road and one hiking trail. Deanna Marsh had been there under a false name for 14 months. Keel's team had found her through the kind of patient, layered intelligence work that didn't leave traces, and had made the deliberate decision not to approach because every previous approach to Callaway's network had been compromised. She has no reason to trust a federal team, Mara said. None, Keel agreed. She has no reason to trust me either. She has one reason, Rhett said. You know the Surkai Valley Protocol. You were there. Not at the strike, but in the theater. You processed casualties. Deanna knows what the protocol is. She knows it was never published. If you use it as an introduction, she'll know you're not compromised infrastructure. And if she shoots me before I get close enough to say anything? She won't, Rhett said. She's a former intelligence analyst. She'll surveil first. You sound very confident about the behavior of someone you haven't seen in 2 years. I'm confident about her training, he said. The behavior follows from the training. Mara looked at Keel. I need a vehicle and I need to go alone. If she sees a team, she's gone. And I need someone monitoring Callaway's cardiac rhythm and calling me if anything changes. I can do that, said one of the agents, a woman younger than the others, with the particular attentiveness of someone who had been listening carefully to everything Mara had done in the last 2 hours. What's your medical training? Combat lifesaver. 2 deployments. Good enough, Mara said. I'll talk you through the parameters before I leave. She spent 15 minutes with the agent, whose name was Torres, going through exactly what to watch for, what the acceptable ranges were, what would require immediate action versus what to monitor and report. Torres absorbed it with the focused, non-performative attention of someone who understood that this matters without needing to be told that explicitly. Mara pulled Rhett's boot from the equipment bag. Someone had removed it during the initial transfer, and she extracted the drive from the lining the way he'd described. A thin, sealed case not much larger than a flash drive, but thicker, with a rubberized coating that had seen considerable wear. She photographed it on her phone, noted the serial number on the casing, and handed it to Keel. Chain of custody starts now, she said. Keel took it. Documented. Mara looked at Rhett once more before she left. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have a clean name for. Not gratitude exactly, because gratitude was softer than what was on his face. More like recognition. The specific look of one person who has spent a long time in a certain kind of world, seen another person who has spent time in the same world, and made different choices about how far to walk away from it. Don't die while I'm gone, she said. Do your job, and I won't have to, he said. She took the keys Keel handed her and went. The drive to the Delmore Range took 51 minutes on roads that got progressively narrower and less maintained as she climbed. She drove without the radio on, which was a choice that surprised her. She usually wanted noise, but tonight she needed the silence because she was trying to reconstruct something. She was trying to reconstruct who she had been before 2014. Not all of it, not the full weight of 2 rotations in Kandahar, the hours in surgical bays that smelled of blood and dust, and the particular sweetness of wound infection, the specific arithmetic of who was going to make it and who wasn't based on what came through the door and what she had available. Not the task force attachment that she still wasn't supposed to talk about and had never talked about, not once, in 10 years of civilian life. Just the part of her that had known, the second a man on a gurney spoke 7 syllables in a classified protocol sequence, exactly what it meant and exactly what to do. She had kept that part very quiet for a long time. The ranger station appeared in her headlights as a dark shape set back among trees, small, as described, with no visible lights. She parked 50 meters short of the access track, cut the engine, and sat for a moment. Then she got out. She walked toward the structure in the dark, and she moved the way she'd been taught to move in environments where being seen before you were ready to be seen was a problem. Not sneaking, which communicated threat, but deliberate, visible, unhurried, hands out from her body, making reasonable noise, giving someone watching time to assess. She stopped about 30 meters from the door. "My name is Mara Voss," she said, at a volume that would carry to the structure without projecting further. "I was Army, 7th Special Forces Group. I was attached to Task Force Meridian in 2012. She paused. "Rhett Calloway sent me." Silence. Wind through the trees, an owl somewhere, briefly. "He's alive," she said. "He's in a secure location. He's stable." She paused again. "He told me you'd surveil before you made a decision. He said your training would hold even after 2 years. He was right." Another silence, longer. Then the door opened. The woman who came out was in her 40s, lean in the way people get lean when they live in the mountains and eat carefully, with dark hair cut short and eyes that had the quality of someone who had been watching every sightline for so long it had become their resting expression. She was holding a firearm that she kept at low ready. Not pointed, but not away either. Mara didn't move. "Say the sequence," Deanna Marsh said. Mara said it, 7 syllables. The classified protocol from a program that hadn't existed officially since 2014. Deanna Marsh's gun hand dropped to her side. She looked at Mara for a long moment, and the expression that crossed her face was one of the most exhausted things Mara had ever seen. Not the exhaustion of sleep deprivation, but the exhaustion of a person who has been holding something terrible by themselves for 2 years and has just for the first time been told they don't have to anymore. "How bad is he?" Deanna said. "He'll recover." "They got to him." "They tried," Mara said. "They didn't finish." Deanna nodded slowly. She looked past Mara at the road, at the tree line, back at Mara. "How many people know where this location is?" "Keel and 2 of her agents." "Keel." "Deputy Director, DIA. You know her?" "I know of her." A pause. "She's clean?" "I believe so," Mara said. "I can't give you certainty I don't have." That seemed to satisfy something. People who had been living on nothing but their own judgment for 2 years had a calibrated response to honest uncertainty that was different from what they had for false assurances. "I have documentation," Deanna said, "beyond the drive Rhett was carrying. Analytical work. The intelligence assessment process that was manipulated to authorize the strike. I have the original unaltered assessment, the altered version submitted to command, and the chain of communication showing who ordered the alterations and who received them." Mara absorbed that. "Can you move it?" "I've had it ready to move for 8 months, Deanna said. "I was waiting for the right moment. I didn't know if there was going to be one. There is now." Deanna looked at her for another long moment, and Mara could see the calculation running. Not distrust exactly, but the comprehensive vetting process of a trained intelligence analyst who had survived this long by not taking things on appearance alone. "You're a nurse," Deanna said. "Currently." "Yes." "But before that you were in the theater during the Surkhai Valley window." "In Kandahar, not at the strike." "But you processed the casualties." Mara was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. Deanna nodded, and there was something in it that felt like the closing of a loop. 2 people who had been adjacent to the same atrocity from different angles, carrying different pieces of the weight of it. "Then you know," Deanna said. "I know enough," Mara said. "I've known enough for a long time." It wasn't an admission she had made out loud before. It sat in the cold air between them with a weight that she let it have. Deanna went back inside. Mara followed. The interior of the station was spare, and organized with the particular precision of someone who had been alone for a long time and had imposed structure as a substitute for the structure other people provided. A cot, a table with a laptop and 2 external drives and a stack of printed documents that Deanna began gathering with practiced, systematic speed. Mara's phone vibrated. Torres. She answered it. His pressure dropped again, Torres said. It came back up, but the elevation pattern is consistent, not random. How elevated is the ST segment? Torres described it. Mara ran the numbers in her head. It's the succinylcholine metabolite. It should clear within the next 3 to 4 hours. Keep the monitoring interval at 3 minutes. If the elevation exceeds, she gave the specific threshold, call me immediately and start him on the oxygen at 4 liters. Copy, Torres said. She hung up. Deanna was watching her from across the table. He's worse than you said. He's complicated, Mara said, which is not the same thing. She paused. How long do you need? 10 minutes. Take 7. Deanna almost smiled. It was thin and brief and the closest thing to normal Mara had seen on her face, and it made her look for a moment like someone who had once been good at laughing. She took 8 minutes, which Mara counted without saying anything. They were nearly at the door when Mara's phone rang again. Not Torres this time. The number she didn't recognize, the same one that had called her in the hospital corridor what felt like an entire other day ago. She answered it. The voice on the other end was male and calm in the specific way that calm is a decision rather than a state. Mara Voss, it said, I understand you've been a busy woman tonight. Something went cold in the center of her chest. I want you to understand the situation clearly, the voice continued. We know where Calloway is. We know where you went tonight, and we have a mutual acquaintance who has just become, how do I put this, a point of leverage. Her mind went to Rhett, to Torres, to Keel. Dr. Marcus Holt, the voice said, is in our custody. He's unharmed. For now, he remains that way on the condition that you and the woman you're currently standing with return everything you have and stand down. Mara looked at Deanna, who had heard enough of the call to understand the shape of it. Deanna's expression had gone flat and still. Not afraid, but processing at speed. You have until 6 a.m., the voice said. That's 4 hours and 11 minutes. The call ended. Mara stood in the cold interior of the ranger station with the dead phone in her hand and the documentation that could end a cover-up on the table behind her, and she thought about Marcus Holt, arrogant, hierarchical, limited in the ways that people with unchallenged authority tend to become limited, a man who had spent that day being wrong about almost everything and had still, in the end, gone to find verified IV supplies because she'd asked him to. And she thought about what 4 hours and 11 minutes actually meant, when the people who'd just called her had already demonstrated that they were inside federal infrastructure, inside hospital supply chains, inside everything that was supposed to be closed. Deanna spoke first. They're not going to release him, she said. Not after. No, Mara said. So we don't trade. No. Then we have 4 hours and 11 minutes to make the trade irrelevant. Deanna picked up the documents. Which means this goes to Keel right now through whatever channel hasn't been touched, and it goes completely, with nothing held back, and whatever happens after that happens publicly enough that there's no percentage in eliminating anyone. That's the logic, Mara said. Is there a problem with the logic? Mara thought about Rhett on a gurney with a succinylcholine metabolite in his blood and a scar she'd just closed on his forehead, saying probably isn't the same as definitely, and I've learned not to confuse them. There are a lot of ways this goes wrong between here and morning, she said. Yes, Deanna said. There are. Outside, through the small window above the door, the tree line was dark, and the road beyond it was dark, and somewhere in that darkness something moved. Mara moved to the window without turning on a light. The shape in the tree line was stationary, not wind-moved, not an animal, the specific stillness of something with intent. She watched it for 4 seconds and then looked away, because staring at a fixed point in low light degraded your peripheral vision, and right now she needed everything her peripheral vision had. How many exits, she said. Front door, back window in the storage room, roof hatch above the cot. Deanna was already moving, calm in the way that 2 years of sustained vigilance produces, not unafraid, but functional in the presence of fear. The back window drops into a dry creek bed, runs north into the tree cover. Is there a vehicle beyond the perimeter? Motorcycle, quarter-mile north on the fire road. I've had it ready since month 3. Mara looked at the documents on the table and made the calculation. Paper was weight and bulk and risk. The drives were small. What's on the drives that isn't in the printed set? The drives have everything. The paper is partial. The clearest pieces, the ones I thought someone would need to understand quickly. Take the drives. Leave the paper. Deanna looked at her. If they search this place, they find paper, Mara said. That tells them what you have. The drives tell them nothing without the password structure. And if they find the paper, they stop looking for what actually matters. A beat. That's a good read. I've had a long night. Deanna took the drives and left the documents arranged on the table in a way that looked like she'd been reviewing them recently rather than abandoning them. Mara dialed Keel. It rang 3 times, too long, and then connected. We have a problem, Mara said. More than one, Keel said, and her voice had an edge to it that hadn't been there before. Callaway's stable, but we've had a perimeter breach on the north side. 1 individual taken into custody. He had communications equipment and a weapon registered to a private military contractor out of Virginia, Halcyon Risk Solutions. You know that name? No. Neither did I, until 40 minutes ago. It's a shell. 3 layers of corporate structure that eventually traces to a holding company controlled by a retired 4-star. A pause. General Warren Steck. He commanded the Surkai Valley Theater in 2013. The name landed with a weight that Mara hadn't expected, because she'd known there was a name at the end of this chain, known it had to belong to someone with enough rank and reach to bury an atrocity and systematically eliminate witnesses across 4 years, and knowing abstractly that a person existed was different from the specific concrete gravity of a name. He has Holt, Mara said. We know. Steck's people called Keel's office 40 minutes ago with the same terms they gave you. 6 a.m. deadline. They called your office, Mara said, which means they know your office number. A silence that confirmed it. How deep does the breach go? Mara said. Deep enough that I'm not routing anything through standard channels tonight. Everything goes direct, person to person, verified. Keel's voice was controlled, but tight. Where are you? At the secondary witness location. I have Deanna Marsh in both drives. We're about to move. There's someone in the tree line watching the property. Can you get to the facility? Not if they're already on the road. There's an alternative extraction point. Keel gave her coordinates, not an address, just numbers, which told Mara that wherever it wasn't in any system that could be accessed remotely. Can you reach it in 90 minutes? Mara did the geography in her head. Possibly, depends on what's between here and there. Go, Keel said. I'll have people at the endpoint. And Mara, yeah. The person we took into custody from the perimeter breach. He talked faster than most. Steck isn't running this from a distance. He's been in Colorado since yesterday. Mara processed that. Steck, a 4-star, personally on the ground, which meant he understood that this had moved past the point where proxies were sufficient. The evidence was too close to federal hands. The window for managing it remotely had closed, and a man who had commanded theater operations in Afghanistan was defaulting to what he knew, direct physical control of the problem. Where is he? Mara said. We don't know yet. She hung up. Deanna was at the back of the station, drives in a waterproof case that she'd produced from under the cot, with the ease of something she'd accessed in her mind 1,000 times, while hoping she'd never actually need to. Mara looked once more at the tree line through the front window. The shape was gone, which was worse than if it had still been there. Now, Mara said. They went through the storage room and out the back window in the order that made physical sense. Deanna first because she knew the creek bed, Mara second. The drop was about 6 feet onto ground that was cold and slightly soft from recent rain, and Mara's left ankle registered the impact with a complaint that she noted and ignored. They moved north along the creek bed without lights, Deanna leading at a pace that suggested she'd rehearsed this route, which she probably had. The motorcycle was where Deanna had said it would be, A mid-sized trail bike, dark-colored, practical rather than fast. Mara had ridden in training and hadn't ridden since, which was a gap of 11 years, and she was honest with herself about the fact that this was not an ideal time to rediscover the skill. "You drive," she said to Deanna. Deanna drove. The fire road was rough and dark, and the bike's headlight made a narrow tunnel of visibility that required Deanna to run at a speed that was slightly too fast for comfort and slightly too slow to feel safe, which was probably exactly the right speed for conditions. Mara held on with her arms around Deanna's midsection and her eyes on the darkness on both sides of the road, and tried to be useful by watching for lights that shouldn't be there. For the first 12 minutes, there were none. Then there were two, well back, keeping pace but not closing. "We have a tail," Mara said, close to Deanna's ear. "I see them." "Is there a split on this road?" 3 kilometers. Goes left into the valley or right toward the ridge. The ridge road is harder, but it connects to the state highway from the north side rather than the main approach. "Ridge," Mara said. "It's unpaved for most of it." "Ridge," Mara said again. Deanna took the right fork without braking more than necessary, which threw them both sideways for a moment in the way that physics insists on, and the tail overshot the fork by what Mara estimated was 3 or 4 seconds before adjusting. That was something. Not enough, but something. The ridge road was exactly as described. The bike handled it better than a car would have, which was presumably why Deanna had chosen a motorcycle over whatever other option might have existed, because 2 years of preparing to run meant thinking about terrain rather than comfort. They came off the ridge onto a paved county road, and Deanna opened up the throttle, and the tail was gone, either lost on the ridge road or reassessing, no way to know which. Mara kept watching. The extraction point turned out to be a decommissioned fire lookout station at the end of a Forest Service road, a squat utilitarian structure on elevated ground with clear sightlines in every direction, which was either a very good place to meet if you were the people inside it, or a very exposed place to approach if you weren't sure yet who was inside it. Mara saw a vehicle she recognized, the same model truck they'd been in earlier, and a figure outside it that resolved, as they got closer, into Torres, not Keel. Mara's hand tightened on Deanna's shoulder. "Stop," and Deanna killed the engine, and they coasted to a halt about 40 meters short of the structure. Torres raised both hands, empty. "It's me," she called. "Keel's inside with Calloway. They moved him 20 minutes ago when the perimeter breach happened." Mara looked at the structure, at the truck, at Torres. Every assessment she had said this was clean. Assessment wasn't certainty, but certainty wasn't available tonight. "How's his rhythm?" she called back. Torres blinked, not expecting a medical question. "Stable. The ST elevation resolved about 30 minutes ago. He's awake and he's been arguing with Keel about operational decisions for the last 20 minutes, so I think he's okay." That was specific enough to be real. They went in. Rhett was on a field cot against the far wall, IV still running, with the color of someone who had moved from critical to serious in the last few hours, and was working on the transition to merely bad. He looked at Mara when she came through the door and then at Deanna, and something in his face shifted in a way that she hadn't seen yet. Something that wasn't strategic or careful or pain-managed, just human, just a man seeing a person he'd been afraid he wouldn't see again. "Deanna," he said. "You look terrible," Deanna said. "You look exactly the same." That's what 2 years of mountain air does. She crossed to him and did the thing that Mara understood without analysis. Set her hand briefly on his shoulder, the contact of people who have been through something together and don't need to describe it, and then stepped back because there was work to do. Keel was at the table with a laptop and a satellite phone and the specific expression of a person who had been managing a deteriorating situation and had just watched it deteriorate further. She looked at the case in Deanna's hand. "Both drives," Mara said. Keel took them. What happened in the next 40 minutes was the kind of work that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Deanna walking Keel through the file structure, the authentication process, the specific documents and their provenance, the chain of intelligence manipulation that led from a field assessment in the Surkai Valley to a falsified command authorization to 31 dead civilians to a cover-up that had consumed 4 years and 11 lives. Mara sat near Rhett's cot and monitored his vitals and listened, because the picture she'd had in fragments for a long time was being assembled in front of her and she wanted to see it whole. It was worse than she'd estimated. General Warren Steck had not acted alone. The falsified intelligence had been processed through a chain of 3 analysts who had been individually pressured or compensated to alter their assessments, and the authorization had been co-signed by 2 additional senior officers who had since retired into positions in the defense contracting sector, positions with Halcyon Risk Solutions and its parent structures. The cover-up wasn't one man protecting himself. It was an architecture, built over time, reinforced at each point where it might have broken, with Steck at the center and a carefully maintained network of mutual dependency around him. Task Force Meridian had been the flaw in the architecture. 11 people who had been in the theater and had seen things that didn't match the official record. 11 people who, if they compared notes, would have assembled exactly the picture that Deanna had just shown Keel. Steck had spent 4 years making sure they never compared notes. Rhett was the last one. Keel had been on the satellite phone twice during the briefing. Short calls, precise, the kind of communication that moved things rather than discussing them. When Deanna finished, Keel sat back and looked at the ceiling for approximately 3 seconds, which was her version of a long pause. "This is enough," she said. "Is it enough to move on Steck directly?" Mara asked. With both drives and a living witness testimony from Calloway and corroborating analysis from Marsh, Keel looked at her. "Yes. It's enough to arrest. It's enough to prosecute. It's enough to take down everyone in the chain who signed off on the cover-up." She paused. "The problem is that Steck knows we have it. The call to your phone, the call to my office. He knows the evidence reached us. He's not going to sit still." "He's going to run," Deanna said. "Or escalate," Rhett said from the cot. Everyone looked at him. "He didn't get to 4 stars by cutting his losses," Rhett said. His voice was rougher now, the long night audible in it, but the clarity was intact. "When Steck decides something is a problem, he doesn't manage it. He eliminates it." He looked at Keel. "He still has Holt. That's not a bargaining chip. That's a message. He's telling you that he can reach into your situation and take someone out of it. He's establishing that he's still in control." Keel's jaw tightened. "We've been trying to locate him since the perimeter breach." "You won't find him through signals intelligence," Rhett said. "He'll have gone dark hours ago. He runs these things the same way he ran operations in the field. Forward command, local assets, communication by physical relay." He paused. "He trained me, actually, years ago. I know how he thinks." A silence settled over the room with a specific weight. "Then tell me where he is," Keel said. "He'll be close to his extraction route. When things collapse, and he knows they're collapsing, he needs to be able to move fast. There are 3 private airfields within 2 hours of this region that handle unscheduled departures without significant scrutiny. Halcyon has connections at 2 of them." He shifted on the cot and his face registered the cost of that. "The 3rd one is Delaney Air Park, 20 miles south of Ashford. It's the one he'd use because it's the one we don't have on paper." "How do you know about it?" "Because I found it 8 months ago when I was building the case," Rhett said, "and I didn't put it in any document I passed to anyone because I didn't know the size of the breach." He looked at Keel steadily. "If Steck runs tonight, he goes through Delaney. If you want him, and you need him because he's the top of the architecture, without him the others negotiate down and some of them walk. You have to be at Delaney before he is." Keel was already on the phone before he finished. Mara looked at Rhett. "You've been holding that for 8 months." "I've been holding a lot of things." "Why didn't you just hand it all to DIA from the beginning?" He was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, assembling an honest answer rather than a convenient one. "Because the first 2 times I tried to pass information through official channels, the people I passed it to were dead within a month. You learn to be careful about what you give to who and when." He looked at the ceiling. "And because I needed it to be complete. One gap in the chain and Steck's lawyers turned the gap into a door. It had to be everything. It almost cost you everything." "Yes," he said. "It did." Keel came back from the phone call with the energized containment of someone who had just set multiple things in motion and was managing the gap between action and result. "I have 2 federal arrest teams en route to Delaney. ETA 45 minutes. Local law enforcement is being brought in through a channel I'm confident about. She looked around the room. We stay here until I get confirmation. 45 minutes became 50. 50 became an hour. Mara adjusted Rhett's IV rate, assessed his laceration under a flashlight that Torres held steady, confirmed that the ST elevation was genuinely resolved and not masking, and did the waiting that she'd learned to do in surgical bays and forward operating areas and every high-stakes context where the only thing available was patience and competence, and the willingness to keep working the variables you could work while the variables you couldn't were in someone else's hands. Deanna sat at the table and wrote, not on a laptop, on paper, in handwriting that was small and deliberate. The kind of writing that meant she was making a record of this moment, of this night, of the end of 2 years of isolation that had no guarantee of ending until tonight it had. Mara watched her do it and thought about the things you carry by yourself for a long time and what happens to them when you're finally allowed to put them down. The satellite phone rang at 11 minutes past 3 in the morning. Keel answered it, listened for 40 seconds without speaking, and then said, "Confirmed. Secure the scene and hold for my team." She set the phone down. The room was very quiet. Steck was at Delaney, she said. He had a vehicle and 2 of Halcyon's people and a private aircraft being fueled when the arrest teams arrived. A pause. He attempted to reach the aircraft. Did he? Mara said. He didn't make it to the stairs. Keel's voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not satisfaction, because satisfaction was the wrong word for something this long and this costly. Something more like the release of a pressure that had been building for a very long time. He's in federal custody. Halcyon personnel are in custody. The aircraft's been impounded. Rhett closed his eyes. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just lay there on the cot with his eyes closed, and Mara watched his chest rise and fall in the steady rhythm that she'd been monitoring for hours. And she thought that this was probably what 4 years of running towards something while being hunted felt like when it finally stopped. Not triumph, not relief exactly, just the strange, heavy quiet of a thing being over. "Holt," Mara said. Keel nodded. They found him in a vehicle at the airfield, physically unharmed. She paused. "He's asking about you, apparently." Mara processed that. "He's asking about me." The agent on site said he's been asking whether the nurse from the ER knew where he was. Keel looked at her with an expression that was impossible to read completely. He said, and I'm quoting the field report, "She'll want to know I'm all right." Something in Mara's chest did a complicated thing. "He's not wrong," she said. The next 3 hours were the administrative and logistical aftermath of something that had been almost entirely unadministrative and unlogistical. Federal agents arrived at the lookout station in stages. First Keel's people, then a broader investigative team, then 2 attorneys from the DIA's legal office who had apparently been waiting on standby for a call that Keel had made at some point in the night that Mara hadn't been privy to. Deanna gave a preliminary statement that lasted 90 minutes and was thorough in the way that 2 years of mental rehearsal makes a statement thorough. Rhett was transported to a proper medical facility, a secured one, DIA-controlled, with a physician who actually looked at the ECG Mara handed over and agreed with her assessment and with her treatment decisions, which she noted with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose clinical judgment had been correct all night. Mara sat in the back of a DIA vehicle at some point around 5 in the morning and ate half a granola bar that Torres had produced from somewhere and looked out at the pre-dawn dark and thought about very little, which was unusual for her. Usually she processed by thinking. Tonight she was too tired and the thing was too large and her mind kept sliding off the edges of it. Her phone rang. The number was the hospital's administrative line, which meant someone at Ralston General knew to reach her this way. She answered it. "Ms. Voss?" The voice was formal, slightly uncertain. "This is Patricia Oakes, Hospital Administration. I've been asked to reach out by the hospital's legal counsel regarding the events of yesterday evening." "It's 5 in the morning, Mara said. "Yes, I understand. I apologize. There are federal agents at the hospital. There's been a significant amount of..." A pause that suggested the word chaos was available, but felt insufficiently professional. I wanted to reach you before you heard things through other channels. The hospital is cooperating fully with the federal investigation into the supply chain incident, and regarding your employment status, what about it? Mara said. Dr. Holt filed a termination recommendation at approximately 10 p.m. last evening, prior to another pause. Prior to the subsequent events, that recommendation is being reviewed. A longer pause. Actually, the hospital's legal counsel has advised that the recommendation is being withdrawn, pending a full review of last night's events and your role in what occurred. Mara looked at the granola bar. Pending a review, she said. Yes. All right, she said. Call me during business hours. She hung up. Torres was in the front seat. Good news? She said. Unknown, Mara said. Probably. The sun came up while they were still driving, the way it does in Colorado in autumn, fast and orange and sudden, the mountains cutting it into sections before it reached the valley floor. Mara watched it through the window with the feeling of a person who has been awake all night and is now watching the beginning of a day that is definitively different from the day before it, and is not yet sure what to do with that difference. Her phone showed 6 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, 3 from a local news station, and 1 from the main number of the United States Senate Armed Services Committee, which she stared at for a long moment before deciding that it could wait until she had slept. The vehicle slowed. They were pulling into the secured medical facility where Rhett had been taken, and through the facility's main entrance she could see, standing just inside the glass doors with a bandage on his forehead and an IV line they hadn't disconnected yet trailing from his left arm, Rhett Calloway, in a hospital gown that was at least 2 sizes too large, looking out at the arriving vehicle with the expression of a man who was not supposed to be out of bed. Torres put the vehicle in park. He's been up since 4:30, she said. The nurses couldn't make him stay down. Mara opened the door. I'm going to have words with his care team about patient compliance, she said. Good luck, Torres said. She walked toward the entrance, and Rhett pushed the door open from the inside, and she was about to say something about the IV and the hospital gown and the fact that it was 40 degrees outside and he was standing in it, when he said, They're calling it the Surkai Files, the evidence package. He said it like that was the most important piece of information available right now, which perhaps for him it was. It's been in federal hands since 3:47 a.m., Keel's team has been processing and authenticating since arrival. She says, he stopped. Something in his face shifted. She says it's complete. The whole chain, no gaps. Mara looked at him. No gaps, she said. No gaps. Behind him, through the facility's interior, she could see a television on a wall mount, a morning news broadcast, the sound off, showing a chyron that she was too far away to read clearly. She could see a press graphic, a photograph of a man in military uniform she didn't recognize yet but would, and the graphic language of a breaking news segment that was clearly in the early stages of a story that was about to become very large. She looked back at Rhett. Come inside, she said. You're in a hospital gown in October. I'm aware. And your IV? I know. Then, I just needed to see you get out of the car, he said, and the simplicity of it stopped her. Because it was not a strategic statement or a tactical one, just a true one from someone who had spent a very long night not knowing what the outcome of a very large number of things was going to be. She took the IV line in her hand to make sure it didn't pull, and they walked inside together, and through the glass doors the morning came in behind them, and on the television screen the story was already beginning to move in the way that true things move when they finally reach the surface. Unstoppable, widening, past the point where anyone could contain it. Except someone inside that facility was about to try. A man Mara had never seen before was standing near the nurse's station. Dark suit, no badge visible, the particular posture of someone accustomed to a specific kind of authority. And when he saw Rhett, he moved toward them with the directed, purposeful stride of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, and his hand was reaching inside his jacket. Mara moved without deciding to move. It was not a heroic impulse. It was the same instinct that had made her step in front of a medication cart in a trauma bay, the body acting on pattern recognition before the conscious mind had finished processing the threat. Her hand came up between Rhett and the man in the dark suit, and she said loudly enough to carry across the nurse's station, Stop right there. The man stopped. His hand was still inside his jacket. Every person in the corridor froze. Nurses, a technician with a blood draw cart, a young resident who had been walking toward the break room and now wasn't walking anywhere. Hands out, Mara said. Both of them. The man looked at her with the expression of someone who had not expected to be challenged by a woman in day-old clothes with granola bar crumbs on her jacket. He was mid-50s, silver at the temples, with the kind of face that had spent decades being deferred to and had forgotten what the alternative looked like. I'm here on behalf of, he started. Hands, she said. Behind her, she heard the door open. Torres came through it. The man withdrew his hand from his jacket. In it was not a weapon, but a folded document. Heavy paper, official seal visible even from across the corridor. He held it up as if it were armor. Gerald Patton, he said. I represent the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I have a classified administrative order requiring the immediate transfer of any evidentiary materials currently in DIA, Deputy Director Keel's possession to... No, said Keel. She had come from somewhere down the corridor. Mara hadn't seen her arrive, but there she was, silver hair, dark blazer, the badge on her lapel catching the fluorescent light, looking at Gerald Patton with an expression of such complete and specific recognition that Mara understood immediately. Keel knew who he was. Keel had been expecting something like this. Deputy Director, Patton began. That order, Keel said, would need to clear federal evidentiary chain of custody protocol, which it cannot do once materials have been submitted to an active criminal investigation, which occurred at 04:12 this morning. She stopped in front of him and held out her hand. I'll take the document. He hesitated. You can give it to me, Keel said, or you can explain to the 3 federal investigators currently 17 minutes away why you attempted to intercept evidence in an active domestic criminal matter. A pause. Your choice. Make it quickly. Patton handed over the document. He looked at Mara once more as he did it. Not with anger exactly, but with the specific expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation he had walked into expecting to control. Then he straightened his jacket and walked back down the corridor with the careful dignity of someone pretending that what had just happened hadn't happened. Torres watched him go. Who was that? Someone's attorney, Keel said, or someone's messenger. We'll find out which. She looked at the document, folded it, and put it in her blazer pocket. It doesn't matter. They're running out of moves. Mara looked at Rhett. He was leaning slightly against the wall, not dramatically, just the lean of a person whose body had been through a great deal and was beginning to present the invoice. The IV line was still in his arm, and the hospital gown was still 2 sizes too large, and there was a fresh bandage on his forehead from the laceration she'd closed in a barn 12 hours ago. Inside, she said. Now, no arguments. I wasn't going to argue, he said. You were about to. He went. The next 72 hours were not clean. Mara had been in situations where the aftermath of a crisis resolved with clear lines and logical sequences, and she had also been in situations where it resolved the way it actually usually does. In fragments, in overlapping processes that didn't wait for each other, in paperwork and testimony and phone calls, and moments of genuine uncertainty about whether the thing that needed to happen was actually going to happen. This was the second kind. She gave her own statement to federal investigators on the first morning, 3 hours, recorded, in a small room at the secured facility with 2 investigators who were thorough in the way that people are when they're building a case rather than confirming a narrative. She told them everything. The IV bag, the tracking device, the corridor in the hospital where a man in a suit had been watching with the wrong badge, the drive in Rhett's boot, the phone call with the 6 a.m. deadline, and the name Marcus Holt used as leverage. She told them about the creek bed and the motorcycle and the fire road at 2 a.m, and she told them about Deanna Marsh's handwriting, small and deliberate, making a record on paper because the drive was already in Keel's hands, and she needed to put something physical on the page. She told them about standing in the hospital corridor at 9:47 in the morning and knowing, from 7 syllables in a protocol that hadn't been officially used in over a decade, exactly what was happening and exactly who she was looking at. The investigator across from her asked, "When you heard the sequence, what was your first thought?" Mara considered the question honestly. That I'd spent 10 years trying to put distance between myself and that part of my life, she said, and that the distance had just become irrelevant. The investigator wrote something. And your second thought? That someone needed help, she said, which is not a complicated thought. It's the same thought I have every shift. What happened publicly began on the second day. The initial reporting was cautious. Federal sources, unnamed, a broad sketch of a military corruption investigation involving a retired four-star. By the third day, the caution was gone. The Surkai files show someone at DOI had used the name in a briefing, and it had reached a reporter, and from there it moved with the momentum of a thing too large and too documented to be managed. 31 civilian deaths in a classified military operation, a falsified intelligence chain, 11 witnesses systematically eliminated, a 4-year cover-up involving a general, 2 retired senior officers, and a private military contractor with congressional connections. Mara watched the first televised press conference from a break room at the secured facility with a cup of coffee she'd stopped tasting about 30 minutes in. Keel stood at a podium flanked by the Deputy Attorney General and the Director of the DIA, and she laid out the case with the precision of someone who had spent a long night ensuring that the precision was possible. General Warren Steck was charged with 31 counts of negligent homicide, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit murder across state lines, and a list of additional charges that the anchor read in a tone of escalating disbelief. 2 co-conspirators from the intelligence chain were charged separately. The directors of Halcyon Risk Solutions, all 3 shell layers of it, were in federal custody. Gerald Patton, the man in the dark suit, turned out to be neither attorney nor messenger, but a former Assistant Deputy Secretary of Defense with his own documented connection to the cover-up authorization chain, and his photograph appeared in the lower left corner of the broadcast with the word "charged" under it. The anchor said the name Surkai Valley in the same sentence as the word atrocity, and it hung in the air of the break room in a way that Mara hadn't been prepared for, because atrocity was the right word, and she had known it was the right word for a long time. And hearing it said publicly and accurately in the present tense, rather than buried in a classified document she wasn't supposed to have seen, was a different thing entirely. Torres sat down next to her with her own coffee. "You okay?" Torres said. "I don't know yet," Mara said. "Fair," Torres said, and didn't push it. On the 4th day, Mara went back to Ralston General. Not because she'd been asked to. The administrative call at 5 in the morning had been followed by 2 more, progressively more formal, from the hospital's legal representation, and she'd returned all of them during business hours as promised, and had listened to the language of institutional repositioning with the patience of someone who understood what it was and why it existed. But she went back in person because there were things she'd left in her locker, and because there was a conversation she needed to have that couldn't happen over the phone. The ER was running its usual controlled chaos when she walked through the main entrance. Gurneys in transit, monitors beeping, the ambient noise of a large urban emergency department processing the relentless volume of human need that didn't pause for anything. She had worked in this building for 2 years, and the noise felt like a language she was fluent in, and the familiarity of it did something complicated in her chest. People looked at her. She had expected that. Her name had appeared in the federal press briefing as a material witness whose actions had been described by Keel as critical to the preservation of evidence and the protection of a federal witness. The hospital's legal team had very quickly updated their position on her employment status, from pending review to unconditional reinstatement with back pay for any missed shifts, which was the language of an institution that had read the press briefing and done the arithmetic. She found Marcus Holt in his office. He was at his desk, which surprised her slightly. She'd half expected him to be somewhere else, doing something that communicated distance from recent events. But he was at his desk with a patient chart open and reading glasses she hadn't known he wore. And when she knocked on the open door, he looked up, and the expression on his face was one she'd never seen on him before. Not guilty, exactly. Holt wasn't built for guilt in the conventional sense. His architecture didn't have that room in it, but something adjacent to it. The specific expression of a man who has encountered evidence that his model of a situation was significantly wrong and is still integrating the new data. "Nurse Voss," he said. "Dr. Holt." A pause. Neither of them moved. I understand, he said, that you were correct. About the patient. Yes. And about the IV. Yes. He took off the reading glasses and set them on the desk. I also understand, he said, that the federal termination notice they handed me during what happened at the airfield contained, among other things, documentation suggesting that someone had accessed our hospital's pharmacy supply manifests approximately 4 hours before the patient arrived. Using credentials issued to someone on our administrative staff, he paused. Someone who had been placed there. I know, Mara said. Which means the poisoning was planned before he arrived, which means someone knew he was coming to this hospital specifically. Yes. He looked at his desk for a moment. I put you out of that trauma bay. You did. And if you'd stayed out, he would have died, Mara said. Probably. The succinylcholine would have presented as cardiac arrest, and it would have looked like a complication of the sedation, and there would have been a record supporting that interpretation. Holt was quiet. You didn't know, she said. You made decisions based on what you had. What I had, he said slowly, didn't include taking seriously anything you said. She let that sit between them because it was true, and because it didn't need her to soften it, and because Holt, whatever his failings, was not a man she was going to lie to. No, she said. It didn't. He picked up the reading glasses and put them back down. The hospital is reinstating you, full terms. The administration wanted me to communicate that the reinstatement comes with... I spoke with legal, she said. I know the terms. I also filed a separate internal report, he said, independent of the legal team's communication, recommending a formal review of my own conduct during the incident and identifying specific procedural decisions I made that were not appropriate to the clinical situation. He said it flatly, which was the only way Holt knew how to say things, but the flatness was working harder than usual. I wanted you to know that before you heard it through the department. Mara looked at him. She thought about the fact that he'd been held in a vehicle at an airfield for 6 hours by people who had been comfortable killing federal witnesses, and that his first question when federal agents found him had apparently been whether the nurse from the ER knew he was all right. Thank you, she said. The report is accurate, he said. Not generous, I was wrong, and the report says so. I know, she said. That's why I'm thanking you. She left him with his chart and his reading glasses and the specific uncomfortable process of a person updating their understanding of themselves, which was not a comfortable process but was, in her experience, the only one that produced anything real. The 31 civilians of the Surkai Valley were named publicly 11 days after the arrest. It happened in the form of a joint statement from the DIA and the Department of Defense, released simultaneously with the federal indictment filing, and it included the name, age, and available biographical information for each person killed in the strike. The youngest was 7. The oldest was 63. Most of them were members of 4 families who had been living in a cluster of structures that had been misidentified in the falsified intelligence assessment as an insurgent compound. The statement included a formal acknowledgement that the strike had been unauthorized under the rules of engagement applicable to the region and the intelligence threshold required for the specific ordinance used. It included an acknowledgement that the subsequent classification and suppression of this information had been deliberate and had involved the falsification of federal records. It included the names of the individuals charged. It did not include an apology, because apology was a word with legal implications that the government's attorneys had advised against, and Mara read the absence of it with the feeling of someone who had expected exactly this and was still, despite having expected it, disappointed. Some things don't resolve cleanly. She had learned that. She was learning it again. The memorial was announced 6 weeks later, a national monument to be constructed on federal land outside Washington, designed by a Pulitzer-winning architect who had been born in Afghanistan and had spent 20 years building things in America and had accepted the commission on the condition that each of the 31 names be inscribed at eye level rather than overhead, because she said people should be able to look names in the face and not have to look up at them. Mara learned that detail from Deanna, who had testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee 4 weeks after the arrest, and had then returned to civilian life in a different city, in a different state. starting over with the specific determination of someone who had been waiting to start over for 2 years and was not going to waste another day of the waiting now that it was done. They talked on the phone occasionally. Not often. They were not, in the conventional sense, friends, because they had met in a burned-down house, and what they shared was more like the particular bond of people who have carried the same weight without knowing it, which was both more and less than friendship. Rhett recovered. This took longer than he made it look. The succinylcholine metabolite cleared, the laceration healed, the blood pressure normalized, and the collection of older injuries that the trauma bay assessment had partially missed, 2 healed rib fractures from what he said was a training accident and what Mara privately assessed as something else entirely, were documented and managed and eventually stopped being things she monitored. He spent 3 weeks in the secured facility and then was transferred to a witness protection arrangement that was more about legal process than genuine threat, because the threat had contracted considerably when Steck and his network went into federal custody. He and Mara talked every few days during the weeks she still had his case in her professional periphery. After that, they talked because they wanted to, which was a different thing. She learned in those conversations that he had been a better soldier than he had ever been comfortable claiming to be, and a worse one than his service record indicated, in the ways that all people are, capable of extraordinary things in specific circumstances and ordinary failures in ordinary ones. He had spent 4 years on a singular mission and had been so deep in it that he wasn't sure yet who he was going to be when the mission was gone. She understood that completely. She had spent 10 years in her own version of the same condition. The military tribunal convened in January. General Warren Steck stood before it with the bearing of a man who had been trained to project authority in every physical circumstance and was still projecting it, even now, which Mara thought said something about the specific character of his particular failure. He had spent so long operating from a position of institutional power that he had confused the position for the person, and even stripped of the position he stood as if the position were still there. The proceedings took 11 days. The testimony was extensive, the documentation comprehensive, and the panel's deliberations lasted less than 3 hours. Steck was convicted on every major charge. He was dishonorably discharged, the formal ceremony stripped of its formality, reduced to paperwork and a bureaucratic notation, because there is nothing ceremonial about the ending of something that should never have been what it was. He was sentenced to 32 years in military correctional custody without the possibility of parole for 14, which was a number that Mara heard from Torres on the phone and sat with quietly, not sure what to do with the math of it. 32 years for 31 lives. The arithmetic was imperfect. The arithmetic was always going to be imperfect. She had known that. The 2 senior officers who had co-signed the authorization, both retired, both embedded in the Halcyon structure, were sentenced separately under a negotiated federal plea arrangement that produced shorter sentences in exchange for full cooperation and documented testimony. One of them had been cooperating since the second day of custody, which suggested that the architecture of mutual dependency Steck had built was less robust than he'd believed. The others in the chain, the 3 analysts, the administrative staff at Ralston General, who had been placed as assets, Gerald Patton, were prosecuted individually over the following 8 months, each case proceeding with the methodical weight of federal prosecution that has more than enough evidence and is not in a hurry. The last case closed in autumn. By then, Mara had been back at Ralston General for months. This had not been a foregone conclusion. The hospital's reinstatement offer had been genuine. The legal team had made that clear, and she'd had time during the federal proceedings to consider whether returning was what she actually wanted, which was a question she'd never had the space to ask before because the work had always just been the work. The daily necessity of showing up and doing it, and the question of whether it was what she wanted, had seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. She could afford it now. The answer, when she sat with it honestly, was yes. Not because Ralston General was perfect, it wasn't. And the supply chain incident had exposed structural vulnerabilities that were being addressed with the enthusiasm of an institution under federal scrutiny, which was to say slowly and imperfectly and not without bureaucratic resistance. Not because her position there had changed in any dramatic sense. She was still a nurse, still an ER nurse specifically, still working shifts that started before the sun came up and ended when her feet had made their feelings known. Not because the hierarchy had been flattened or the culture had been transformed or any of the other things that people say happened in institutions that went through crises and came out changed. She went back because the work was real. That was the thing she'd never found a way to leave behind, even when she'd tried, even when she'd spent 10 years building civilian distance from everything that had made her who she was. The work was the thing that happened between the moment a gurney came through a door and the moment a person was stable, and everything that existed in that space was real in a way that very little else was. It was real when it worked, and it was real when it didn't. And it was real when the person who came through the door was a federal witness. And it was real when they were a 70-year-old woman who'd fallen in her kitchen and was scared and in pain and needed someone to be steady. She was good at steady. She had learned it in the field, and she had kept it through everything, and it had turned out to be the thing that mattered most when most things were falling apart. Holt's internal report went through the department review in February. The outcome was not his termination. The review panel had found that his clinical decisions, while flawed, fell within the range of decisions a physician could make without malicious intent under the information available. What the review produced was a formal reprimand, documented in his personnel file, and a mandatory protocol update for how the department handled unidentified trauma patients presenting with behavioral indicators inconsistent with psychiatric emergency. It was not everything, but it was a thing that would outlast the reprimand, because the protocol would still be there in 5 years when Holt was gone, and that was how change actually worked in institutions, not in the dramatic moments, but in the small structural adjustments that followed them. Holt never apologized directly. That wasn't the language he spoke. But in the months after she returned, he began, slowly, in ways that could have been coincidental if you weren't paying attention, to ask her opinion on presentations he was uncertain about. Not to defer to it, just to ask. To include it in his assessment of the situation. It was the size of the concession he was capable of making, and she took it for what it was. She was in the break room one afternoon in March, a Tuesday, midway through a shift, eating something that had been hot 20 minutes ago and was now aggressively lukewarm, when her phone rang. Rhett. "How's the ankle?" he said. "Fine," she said. "It was fine 3 weeks ago when you asked." "I know, I'm checking." "You're not very subtle." "I'm extremely subtle," he said. "You're just very good at reading people." She ate a bite of what had been soup. "How's the testimony process?" "Almost done. Last deposition is next week." A pause. "After that, I'm apparently a civilian again. For real this time." "How does that feel?" He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, actually thinking about it. "Strange," he said, "like standing in a room where all the furniture has been rearranged, and you keep reaching for things that aren't where they used to be." "You'll figure it out," she said. "I know." Another pause. "I might come to Colorado." "You might, if that would be acceptable." She looked at the lukewarm soup and the break room's fluorescent light, and the window that looked onto the parking lot where she'd watched federal helicopters land on a Tuesday morning that felt like a different calendar year entirely, even though it was less than 6 months ago. "It would be acceptable," she said. Outside the break room, she could hear the ER. Monitors, voices, the rolling approach of a gurney on linoleum. Someone's name being called. The sounds of a place that never stopped needing what it needed. She hung up the phone and finished the soup and went back to work. The Surkai Memorial opened in October, on a clear morning with a crowd large enough that the edges of it were not visible from the center. Mara was there, not as a dignitary, not in any official capacity, but as someone who had been present at a particular moment in the chain of events that led to this morning, which felt like the right reason to be present at its end. Deanna was there. Rhett was there. In civilian clothes, standing with a slight favoring of his left side that was new and would probably always be there, and that he didn't acknowledge because acknowledging it was the kind of thing he didn't do. Keel was there in her capacity as deputy director, at the edge of the official group, watching with the expression of someone who knew the size of what it had cost to arrive at this moment, and was not going to pretend otherwise. The 31 names were at eye level, just as the architect had said they would be, inscribed in the dark stone with a precision that made each letter feel chosen. The youngest was 7. The oldest was 63. They were real people who had lived in a specific place and had died because someone with the power to classify things had decided that their existence was less important than his protection. They were no longer classified. They were on stone, in public, in the light. Mara stood in front of the inscription for a long time, long enough that Rhett came to stand next to her without saying anything, because he knew, as she knew, that there are moments where the right thing to do is simply stay and bear witness and let the weight of something be exactly as heavy as it is. She had spent 10 years keeping a distance from who she'd been. She had spent the last 6 months understanding that the distance hadn't been the wrong choice. She had needed it, needed the time and the civilian life and the work that was just the work, the daily practice of keeping people alive without a strategic objective attached to it. She had needed to become someone who knew what steady felt like from the inside rather than as a learned behavior. But the person she'd been had also been real. The medic who'd learned a classified protocol in a forward operating area in 2012. The woman who'd looked at a man on a gurney and heard 7 syllables and known, without hesitation, exactly what they meant and exactly what they required. She was not going to keep those two things separate anymore. They were both her. They had always both been her. The mistake had been believing that one of them had to disappear for the other to exist. The ceremony concluded. People moved. The crowd shifted and thinned in the way that crowds do when a formal event becomes an informal one, and conversations started and photographs were taken, and a young senator from the Armed Services Committee gave a statement to reporters that used the word accountability 3 times and never again once. And Mara listened to the word accountability with the specific feeling of someone who knew what it had actually taken to get here and what it had cost and how many different ways it could have ended differently. She turned to Rhett. "What now?" she said. He thought about it. "I was thinking," he said, "that I've been doing one thing for 4 years and I genuinely don't know what else I know how to do." "You know how to keep going," she said. "That's not a skill set." "It is actually," she said. "It's one of the more important ones." He looked at her. She looked back at him, and at the names on the stone behind him, and at the sky above the memorial that was the particular pale blue of Colorado in October, which she had been looking at for 2 years from the window of a hospital break room and had never quite noticed was that color until right now. There are things you carry so long that you forget you're carrying them. The weight becomes part of how you stand, part of your posture, part of the constant background effort of staying upright. And when you finally put them down, not abandon them, not deny them, but put them down properly, in the right place, in the right way, the absence of the weight is its own kind of gravity. You have to learn to stand differently. Mara had learned a lot of things in her life. She had learned clinical protocols and classified communication sequences, and how to run an IV line in the dark, and how to close a wound with materials that were not quite right for the job. She had learned when to speak and when to stay quiet, and when to step in front of someone who was reaching for the wrong thing. She was learning now that the version of herself she had kept at a distance was not something she needed to fear. It was just part of the full picture. It was just who she was, all of it, the military medic and the ER nurse, and the woman who had stood in a corridor at 9:47 in the morning and heard 7 syllables and made a decision that most people would never have known how to make. Not because she was extraordinary, because she had paid attention for a long time to the things that mattered. And because when the moment arrived, the specific, unrepeatable, high-cost moment when the right thing and the easy thing were not the same thing, she had known the difference. That was the thing. Nobody told you about the kind of courage that actually matters. It doesn't look like courage from the inside. It looks like doing your job. It looks like refusing to leave a patient because you know something the physician doesn't, and being removed from the room anyway, and coming back anyway. It looks like standing in a cold corridor with your phone in your hand, thinking about a number you haven't called in 10 years, and making the decision not to call it and to handle it yourself. It looks like showing up, knowing what you know, and refusing, quietly, without announcement, without anyone watching, to be less than what you are. She had done that. She would do it again. The memorial stood in the October light with 31 names on its face, and the sky above it was very blue. And somewhere behind her, the senator was still talking about accountability. And somewhere in the crowd, Deanna Marsh was having a conversation that was probably about next steps, and probably also about something she'd been wanting to say for 2 years that had nothing to do with legal proceedings. And Torres was near the entrance talking to a young woman in a DIA badge who was clearly asking her something she was considering answering. And Maravos stood in front of the stone, in her own clothes, on her own feet, holding nothing she didn't choose to hold. That was enough. That was in fact everything.